Everybody knows you can negotiate the price, but in this standard real estate contract that we use here in Florida, there are 20 negotiable things in this contract. So I'd like to tell you about them so that next time you're buying or selling, you'll know that everything is negotiable. So first of all, of course, everybody knows the price is negotiable. That's probably the cornerstone of the whole contract, but a few other things are personal items that go along with the property. Typically, that's things like a washer and a dryer or maybe a microwave or some other kind of appliance. But the truth is, everything's negotiable in real estate. If you like that bird bath out back, you can write it in the contract. The escrow deposit, also known as good faith money, that amount is totally negotiable. Now, there are customs associated with that, and your realtor can fill you in and give you some advice on what an appropriate deposit would be. Sometimes there's an additional deposit. Like, for example, after the inspection period is over, another deposit can be made. That's totally negotiable. Time for acceptance is negotiable. That's the time that you're giving the other party to sign the contract. Now, let me give you some advice here. Don't put a few hours just to put some pressure on them. It doesn't work. Everybody ignores that and changes it around whatever they want to do. So if you think that's a good negotiating tactic to just make it seem like it's super urgent, it isn't. So don't bother doing it. Also, the closing date is negotiable. Now, obviously, if you're doing a mortgage, you're going to need to have a certain amount of time so the lender can do their work. But you can negotiate when the closing is in case you have certain timelines that you have to stay within. Whether or not you're allowed to extend the closing date. Sometimes things happen. It takes a little bit longer to get the mortgage or some other circumstances. The repairs take longer than expected. You can extend the closing date, and that is totally negotiable. The next two are related. Occupancy and possession, that's when you get possession of the property. Now, normally, as soon as the funds are transferred, you are handed the keys and that house is yours for that moment forward. But that is something that can be negotiated, and also it's possible the seller could arrange a lease back. Maybe that you're going to give them a little bit of time to stay in the property after it belongs to you. Now, of course, we generally don't recommend doing that, but again, everything is negotiable. Assignability is another one, and this is one that's really easy to overlook if you're a seller. That's whether or not the buyer is allowed to assign that contract to a third party. Now, a lot of investors do this, and if assignability is an issue, talk it over with your agent, because this can be a very, very important point in the contract that could really mess things up later on. Financing is negotiable. How much gets financed, and also what type of loan might be acceptable. For example, we see a lot of cash and conventional, but they don't allow FHA or VA. Now, typically that's because the property won't pass an FHA or VA inspection. Those two loan types have certain restrictions on what kind of property can be purchased with the loan. Conventional, the bar is a little bit lower. Closing costs. Sometimes sellers will offer to pay part of the closing costs for the buyer. These are all things that are negotiable, and credits are more common when it's a buyer's market, and of course when it's a seller's market they become less common. Also, who pays for what in the closing process? Now, here in the area where we live, it's customary for the seller to pay for the title insurance. But again, that's something that is all negotiable, as is who handles the transaction closing. Now, here in Florida, usually it's a title company, but which title company? That's totally negotiable, and also lawyers are sometimes used to handle the closing of the transaction. When that title insurance is due is another negotiable thing. Now, normally it's 15 days before closing. Title insurance guarantees the transfer of clear title to the property for the buyer. Assessments is another thing that's negotiable. If there are any assessments due on the property, the seller can pay them at closing, or they may pay what we call installments up to the date of closing, at which time after closing they'd be the responsibility of the buyer. So those are things that are totally negotiable. This next one's important. Now, normally, even with an as-is contract, it's as-is with the right to inspect. The buyer will have a certain amount of time to conduct any inspections, and during that time, they may be able to cancel the contract. Now, again, this is negotiable. It's whatever the contract says goes. But normally, a buyer gets a certain number of days to conduct inspections. If anything's revealed that's a problem, it'll be discussed between the parties, and they'll come to an agreement. Maybe a credit is issued so the buyer can take care of the repairs themselves, or the seller may be responsible to do the repairs before closing. What happens if the buyer or the seller were to default on the contract? That's all covered in the contract, and those are negotiable as to what would happen and who would be responsible for what. Another thing that's negotiable is access to the property. Now, during the contract time, you don't just get access to the property whenever you feel like it, because that property doesn't belong to you yet. But there are certain things that have to be negotiated, like access for inspectors and maybe contractors, a walkthrough before closing. There are certain access points that are common during a contract, but you may negotiate other things. Maybe you need to have a series of people come in and look at the property to make plans for changes that you want to make to the property. Again, all negotiable. Another negotiable point is who pays the buyer's broker. The buyer's broker obviously is going to get paid, and usually the buyer is responsible for it, but it'll be written into the contract where the seller will credit the buyer out of the proceeds of the sale. But again, that's one thing that is completely negotiable. And then number 20, a catch-all, additional terms. That's where anything that's not covered in these other 19 areas can be written into the contract and become part of the contract. Now, that's totally negotiable and something that you can talk about with your agent. So, as you can see, real estate, it's complicated. It's something that's a very complex process, and always you need a good, solid, knowledgeable professional to guide you through that process to make it as stress-free as possible. So if you or someone you know have any questions about real estate, let me know. I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.